which is one of the most game-changing reforms in independent India. It's not just about one tax, one India. It has a lot to do with a big economic legislation that will result of some amendments in the Indian Constitution. It's India for GST, and the opposition, it looks like, is only political in nature. But to discuss and debate all of that, and to push the GST through, that is a game-changing legislation and will change the way India does business, we're joined by a very special panel right here at FICCI. We've got Neotia, the President, Ms. Naina Kidwai, and Dr. Arvind Virmani. Thanks a lot for joining us as we begin our campaign on India for GST. It really has been a legislation that has been in the works for almost over a decade now, and political parties don't seem to be building that consensus that seems to elude, and which is why I'm leaving it to corporates and economists like yourself to help build that consensus. I first want to specifically talk to you about the Parliament session and the importance that it assumes given the kind of legislation that it will see. Mr. Neotia, if I may begin with you, this is a very important Parliament session. Most people believe if the GST doesn't get passed in this session, then we should perhaps forget about that game-changing legislation. Are you willing at all to assume that importance to this session alone?
Well, I certainly think that it's a very important legislation, and this session should see it through. I mean, this is the sense that I get out of talking to people around. And also, I think the country has waited long enough for this. So I think also the issues have pretty much got narrowed down. And I think that while there still seems to be some ticklish points, but there is a convergence on some halfway solutions to at least one or two of those issues. So I think I am very hopeful that it will go through this time.
On that optimistic note, Ms. Kidwai, if I may turn this to you, are you as hopeful as well that this Parliament session, politicians will be able to set aside political differences and narrow down to what is perhaps the key reform that economically liberalized India will see?
I must say, I would have and have betted on it having been passed earlier, and I have been wrong each time, because good sense, I thought, would always prevail. National priorities should prevail. This legislation is good for India. It will bring back the growth we so desperately need. We know it would add at least 2% back to the GDP of the country. How can we hold up this very important piece of legislation and still be called Indians at heart and Indians in mind? Ticklish issues, of course, there are always ticklish issues. I think actually a lot of the ticklish issues lie much more in the implementation and execution than in the legislation itself. But the amount of energy and time that has gone on resolving what seems to be much more of a political battle than a real battle is taking away the very important energy and time that we need to ensure that the implementation is smooth, for which we need the automation, the systems. Industry needs to fully understand how it converts the supply chain into this. So the good news here is that the GST bill has now been put up for public comment. I understand that FICCI, we have received a huge amount of input, which of course will be shared with all concerned. And the fact that this process of execution is finally being looked at and is happening, that industry is being able to clear the air in terms of how to implement, would also suggest that there is hope in the air. So I would like to believe, and I will bet once again, that this has to happen and should happen in this session of Parliament.
And you will also hope that you're proven right this time around. But Dr. Virmani, if I may ask you this question, you know, there seems to be some amount of optimism, and I will come to science in just a bit, because this is all about the GST. We need to get down to specifics and the semantics. But because we are, you know, two people on my panel believe that they're far more optimistic of the GST because of the importance it assumes, and at a time like this. Is the opposition to the GST, or is the logjam on the GST, will you agree with the rest of us here, it's purely political?
Well, let me put it this way. You know, we discussed the transparency of reform by stealth. This is one of the most transparent reforms we have seen, not more, it is probably the most. For 10 years, we've tried to build a consensus. The thinking on it started before that, 12, 15 years ago. It's been discussed with every state, every party, every group, everybody. So you can't have a more transparent process. So that's one thing people must understand. And the second part is more specifically to your question. I would say there's a better than even chance. I really, because of the past experiences of these things. But alluding to your first part, your introduction, I wouldn't give up, even if it doesn't happen. We are hopeful. I think the President has said that he's quite hopeful, and I hope he's right. But even if it doesn't happen, we shouldn't give up for the broad reason I've outlined. Of course, the details of how good or bad it is, we will discuss.
I'd just like to add to say that, well, there is certainly politics in this, and there is no debate about the fact that lots of issues have got muddled up into it, along with the concerns on its implementation and concerns on some of the issues. There is a certain political position different parties have taken for different reasons. But we must also know that in these last few months, there has been some changes in the composition of the parliament. And that too has given some more, if I may say, ballast into the, more wind into the sails of the pro-GST lobby.
Right.
So even though I believe that theoretically the numbers don't fully stack up, but they are very much close to
sentimentally speaking, the pro-lobby has advantage right now.
Correct.
Would you agree with that? Is that the sign that Indian industry is picking up as well?
The President is much closer to the politics of this, but I would certainly like to believe that is the case. And I think the important thing is the way the centre has engaged with the states has been really quite valuable. It's been very intense in terms of discussion. We've heard it directly from the finance minister and his own outreach. And the fact that the states are coming together, the fact that there's very effective leadership there that is driving some of the discussions of the states and their position on GST is also valuable, because there are legitimate concerns among states which need to be addressed and taken care of and explained. And I think exactly as Arvind says, that process is out in the public domain. It is happening. And I think I would like to believe that the detractors are now firmly on board as well.
I will come back to the demands that have been narrowed down. It's almost distilled down, if I may use that word. But Dr. Virmani, I do want to touch upon the merits of the GST. Like Ms. Kidwai said there, it has the potential of spurring economic growth, add 1.5 to 2% to our GDP. But, let me ask you a contrarian question. Are merits of the GST being overstated? Because this is not the ideal GST. This is not the GST that we started with. This does not include electricity. This has petrol out. This has alcohol out. This is not the ideal legislation which would have said one tax, one India. Are merits being overstated at this stage?
There's two parts answer I would give. One is that the three items you mentioned, with the possible exception of one, most of them are what we call final goods. And actually, leaving out a few critical final goods is not at all critical for the success of a value-added tax.
Okay.
The whole point is we are shifting to a value-added tax. And if you leave out, in fact, I had once suggested that have a few retail taxes and give them to the states, so they would feel empowered and let you do everything else. But unfortunately, that's not the way we've gone. The second part of it is it's a great opportunity to introduce huge simplification. And this is where what Naina has said becomes very, very important. And that is to just junk all the tax terrorism which exists in the excise and other laws, and really use this opportunity.
It's really a clean-up exercise.
Clean-up, which must take place. I don't think that is complete.
Yeah.
And that's why I want to endorse what she's saying. Once the legislation, the constitutional amendment goes through, we must focus more on this aspect.
I do want to, though, touch upon this point a little further and fine-tune this more. The merits of the GST are obviously for all of us to see, and which is why the whole campaign that India for GST. But I'm going to go back to the question that I asked. Are merits being overstated, and how hopeful are you that the things that are being left out for now and, have been said that they will be included at a later date, will the government have the wherewithal, the political capital to do it at a later date? Things like alcohol, petrol, that the states are really opposed to. And they form huge chunks of our, goods to be taxed.
Well, the way I look at it is that the biggest advantage will be to get the GST off the ground. And once we start seeing the merits of that, I think the case for getting other goods which are left out at the moment gets strengthened. To me, the most important issue is that the compliance would be far more transparent across the board. And in fact, the GST that will move up is a lot, not because there is going to happen actual growth, but the growth which is not getting recorded would actually get recorded. So all this, the government is making a lot of strong pitch for eradicating black money and for the parallel economy to be sort of phased out. So this is a very, very key legislation to enable that to happen. And putting everyone onto because you don't get the credit unless you come into this space. So I think the disincentive to be evading taxes would increase, and that would itself become a very big reason for compliance across the board.
I do want to shift focus and talk about specifics right now. And Mr. Neotia, if I may begin with you, what are the three demands that the Congress party has raised, and where are the issues of differences? The 1% additional levy should go as demand number one, and I think there's a broad consensus on that going. But let's begin with that. What are the demerits of having something like this? The manufacturing states are still not seeing eye to eye on that. Tamil Nadu was deeply against not just that provision, but against the GST, so to say. But if I want to get down to specifics, because we've never had the discussion on specifics, so to say. 1% additional levy, what is wrong with it?
Well, the same argument that if you start putting these kind of different issues, like as much as you just said that there are some things that have been left out.
There'll always be a distortion.
So this will always be a distortion. So I think broadly, I think there is consensus, and except for Tamil Nadu, where I believe there is still some concern, even other producing states have now come on board, including some BJP ones, to say that fine, we will go ahead with this. So I think it should not be there, and that's really what I think broadly even the government is veering around to accepting.
Yeah, I think the government has broadly made its position more or less clear that 1% additional levy should go. But Ms. Kidwai, if I may ask you, the manufacturing states are justified in their demand to have that 1% additional levy, because they do believe if they're not going to be compensated, why not give them credit for having a 1% additional levy? Is that demand justified?
The fact that they feel disadvantaged in the arithmetic, there's merit. But they're not going to remain manufacturing states very long if they aren't subscribing. So if you were to take, it's not that that's the way it happens, but if a GST were to go through with a state that wasn't on board, that state is certainly going to suffer from not being part of an overarching GST regulation, which for all the reasons we've discussed is a positive. So, are there ways of looking at how the state own issues can be looked at and compensated in some way? Possibly, but it shouldn't happen that we bring it with this sort of 1% overall.
And distort it even further.
Yeah, and the 1%, before you know it, creeps up to become 2 and 5. We've seen that before. Precisely. So we shouldn't be opening up that Pandora's box at all.
You're queuing me to my next question, but I'm going to just ask you to come in on the 1%.
So very briefly, 5 years ago when this whole issue of compensation was raised, it was precisely to get rid of the 2% central sales tax.
That's right, yeah.
So actually, I think I was still in the ministry, then I was surprised that they had come to a compromise leaving this 1%, because the whole point of assuring that for 3 years or for 5 years the center would compensate any loss of revenue was precisely to get rid of the CST. So I don't think at all the states are justified, given that I think 3 to 5 years has been agreed as full compensation.
That's right. So let's keep that 1% aside, because I think there's a broad political consensus that it will go. Let me begin the second round with you, Dr. Virmani. The second round has to do with the cap on the GST rate. The Congress party for long has insisted that it should be a part of the constitution bill. The government believes it's impractical to do so. You can't go ahead and amend the constitution. The fear on the other side is that if you don't put a cap of some sort, GST levels could creep upwards of 20, 22, 25%. My question largely is that we're now hearing the right voices, at least sections within the Congress are saying ring fence the rate, put it in the GST bill, if not the constitution. What kind of a consensus can come on that? And is the fear of a higher creeping of the GST rate justified at this stage?
So the main objection I and many others had was that there is, I know of no tax rates ever in the constitution. So that was clearly appeared to be a very political sort of demand, which one as an economist couldn't accept. But you're right. We are hearing that there is already a movement on that, and that's very good. I'm very happy. And the other matter is a political matter they can discuss and see how to put it in. Is it justified? Yes. I mean, that's a political issue. If a very legitimate question to raise that, a good, just to give a little bit of economics, a good tax reform is actually revenue neutral in its calculation,
That's right, yes.
but gives you more revenues because of the points both of them have made about better compliance and more revenues coming from those outside the net. So that the current payers should not feel that they've been had, or whatever word you want to use.
True.
So in that sense, it's a valid demand to say, okay, what is the correct revenue neutral in the first year in the calculation, and we should not exceed that. So that's a fair demand.
It's a fair demand indeed, but a demand that warrants you to put a number somewhere, whether it's going to be a part of the Constitution bill, and I think the climb down has been, don't make it a part of the Constitution, make it a part of the GST bill, ring fence it in some way. But is the demand justified? Because you can't have a GST that favors, like somebody in the Congress says, South Bombay and not Jumri Talaya. You can't have GST rates of over 25, 22, 23%. Is that a valid concern, you think?
It's certainly valid, and as Arvind rightly suggested, there is an arithmetic to what is that revenue, the neutral rate, which works and which is the right rate. And debate and discussion around that has been happening. Establishing what that cutoff is, I think, is important. I think the issue doesn't seem to be so much the 18% as much as should it go in the Constitution or not.
Right.
Whereas actually the debate should possibly have been more around the rate.
Yes, yes.
So I would like to assume that 18, is the sort of number that is floating around.
Well, 15 has been mentioned,
Yeah.
15 to 18.
18 is where the broad consensus.
I think that's where it is.
Right.
You're right, it started lower.
Yes.
And I think we can all live with that, so go with that. But one of the important points that we haven't touched on is the benefit to the consumer.
Absolutely.
At the end of the way, the citizen of India pays a tax which at the back of every product amounts to as much as 25 to 30% at times. Is that the right taxation rate for every product that we consume? Surely we can have efficiency there. And as that efficiency comes in through better tax collection, hopefully we will actually see the purchase price of the products as citizens, forget corporates looking at their own position, but as citizens actually come off. And how, look at the impact of that on inflation and purchasing power of people and putting demand back into the system.
Let me begin this round with you, Ms. Kidwai. Dispute resolution. The Congress party says, how can disputants resolve their own dispute? The government says, how can I give up my right to legitimately, or right of taxation to another court? Are there arguments that find favor on both sides, according to you?
Look, I'm a great one for believing we need dispute resolution mechanisms outside of the courts.
Because
the
it
courts
takes forever.
are overburdened.
Yeah.
The courts, 85% of legislation in the courts is to do with tax, where government is on one side. So the last thing we need is, and with a new law, let's face it, there will be lack of clarity, there will be issues, and particularly in the settling in period, there's likely to be
some amount of litigation.
Yeah. So let's have a mechanism which is swift, quick, enables clarity, so that the next bunch of disputes don't arise, because what happens is you've got this pile up of the same issue, which keeps piling up because the first issue hasn't been resolved. And do this through mechanisms, and government has used these mechanisms before.
In the past,
we have seen, sort of special tribunals, etc., come up from time to time. So having a mechanism which sits outside the courts, to my mind, is realistic. You don't have to leave it like that forever. Maybe you time define it in some way and give it a clear sort of mandate.
That's a rather pragmatic solution to this. You agree with this?
I would agree with that. The idea, what I've understood is that it was the way that the dispute resolution mechanism will be structured. What kind of voting patterns would be there for.
Yes.
So I think it's all about weightages. And I think that can be resolved through a discussion, because again these weightages are of different combination of what the center will have and the states will have. And you know, we are looking at something as of today that this is what is going to remain. The states are going to go through elections. There's going to be a change in composition. There could be a change in composition. So this is a very dynamic process. I think the
too many moving parts to it, really.
So really, I mean, something that looks advantageous to one today could be quite different tomorrow.
True.
So I think what they need to do is to evolve a consensus to see what is a reasonable way of sort of addressing this, and leave it at that, rather than to look at it how it benefits a particular party or a group today.
Just to add one very briefly, you know, this is one of the things which have taken 5 years to resolve. It's not a new issue. This is precisely what has been discussed.
And if a resolution hasn't happened in 5 years, then
no, but it involves the states. It is not a question of 2 or 3 parties at the center. This whole issue has been discussed threadbare with the states and center, and they have now come, now meaning they had come by 2013 or whenever the previous government was there, they had finally come on board. So now disturbing it means kind of opening a Pandora's box. So I mean, purely practical, though I agree with what Naina said in weighing between judicial and all, but my perspective would be this has been resolved, this has been agreed.
So let's not go back to the drawing board.
Open the whole thing again. And
but I think both sides have an argument there. But let's shift focus and talk about preparedness. And preparedness both at the part of Indian industry, at the part of the government, the IT enablers. Let me begin with you, Mr. Neotia, this round. You know, GST is considered to be the panacea of all economic ills, so to say. But I think what a lot of people lose sight of is GST may pass in this session, but it's not as if it can be implemented tomorrow. You know, there has to be states that have to ratify this. There has to be an IST, a CST, and all of that has to come in. And then, of course, the IT. How prepared is India for a GST? We've had an April 1, 2016 deadline. We have an April 1, 2017 deadline. I'm not going to get into deadlines, but I'm still going to ask you, how prepared are we?
Well, I am sure that, you know, we are not absolutely fully prepared in every sense, but I don't think you can ever be fully prepared till the day comes.
Right.
The second point I'd like to make is that over this period of last 2-3 years, when this whole thing has been really hot, I'm sure a lot of preparation has gone in mentally for corporates as well as for the government of how they will implement it. So I think we are fairly prepared. Much more today than perhaps we were 3 years ago if the GST came in, and therefore to that extent I feel that the you know, the settling in of the GST would take a shorter time with perhaps less challenges. But that's not to say that there won't be any. Whichever country had this have had some challenges. But you know, when we look about a transformative legislation, we have to be prepared for the transition period that will throw up some issues. And I don't think the country can expect some kind of a magic wand to say that there would be no transitional issues.
Precisely.
But I don't think it would be insurmountable. That's my sense.
I'm going to close this and ask you a more big picture question. You know, we are also talking at a time when India is celebrating 25 years of economic reforms. 1991, we opened up our economy. But as far as reforms are concerned, and I'm talking about the big bang ones like the GST is, have we been too slow on this? Could there have been any other way, or do you believe this is the way India is going to reform? There will be consensus, there will be too much of back and forth, but eventually we will perhaps go and do the right thing.
I think we will do it this way only. We could wish that it could be slightly different.
The sense of resignation.
No, it's not exactly resignation. I think we are a noisy democracy, and I think we debate a lot of issues, perhaps a lot of issues which are not very important. Sometimes they are perhaps at cross purposes. But I think we take out our frustrations, our anger, our disappointments through this very interesting, chaotic process. And I think that's the way we would like probably our country to be, in the sense that we would not like to be dictated as having one idea and supposing, you know, the others who oppose it, we should just sort of ramrod it and push it through.
Right.
I really don't think we are prepared for it. We are too multicultural, we are too diverse in our ethnic composition, we have various ways of looking at life. We worship so many gods, we're losing count of that. I just don't think that we are mentally, emotionally and psychologically tuned to be, say, let's say, as another example, be like the Chinese.
That's right.
They may have, therefore, in a shorter run, a more successful economic model. But maybe the happiness quotient of Indians, even though economically not so much,
is a lot
would
higher.
be higher perhaps. That's my sense. But I mean, this is not something easy to measure. So I wouldn't like to be held at a gunpoint on that. But I just think that's the way we are.
This is the first major constitutional amendment connected with economics. It's never happened
and not
before.
just tax alone.
It is not a question of tax. It's the first economic amendment. Everything else was social, even the land legislation.
This is pure economics.
Yeah, this is the first, because the states are giving up certain powers. Let's not ignore that. And I must commend them that they have been persuaded. Maybe one would have hoped instead of 12 years, we could have done it in 8 years. But it's a huge, huge thing.
It's a shift
People
of
must
power
realize
in that
this.
sense, yeah.
It's not a question of shift of power. It's a question of voluntarily coming together in the public interest, in the general interest, whether it's Tamil Nadu, Bihar, etc., and of course the union, which has to think of everybody, all coming together to say this element of the constitution is no longer useful for this nation. And I would say we should also play the positive role up. I'm hugely, I'll be celebrating the day the constitutional amendment is passed.
We will all
Personally.
be celebrating the constitutional amendment.
No, I don't mean economically, but personally. I mean, just...
Fair point indeed, and that's a very valid assessment of the situation, that states are also coming together to give up some of their ground. But on that note, thank you very much, each one of you, for talking to us. India for GST, and we do hope it is going to see the light of day this session. Thank you very much.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.